Spoilers ahead for Moon Knight Episode 4. You've been warned. I don't really do episode by episode content on releasing TV shows, but I wanted to make a little exception and talk about the 4th episode of Marvel's new series Moon Knight, because it was a really interesting episode in a lot of ways. There's compelling character drama, some fun horror influences, and that whole hospital sequence represents some of the most engaging material Marvel has put out in years. More of this type of thing, please, Marvel. But that's not what I want to talk about here, not exactly. Instead, I want to hyper-focus in on one little moment and talk about why I think it brought this 4th episode to the next level. And that's this shot, or more accurately, the way this shot transitions, from Marc's body sinking into a pool, to Marc's body floating upwards towards a moon, to that moon becoming the flashing torch helping to guide famed explorer Stephen Grant in the VHS Marc's watching in the limbo hospital setting, which closes out the episode. It's all over in a minute or so, but that minute or so is one of the most surreal and visually rich sections of a Marvel property we've had in months, if not longer. You see, Marvel tends to have something of an in-house visual style. That's not to say that individual directors don't bring their own visual sensibilities to the table. They can and do, but more often than not, they're doing so within the confines of a broadly uniform and broadly realist system. This moment kind of throws that out the window, as the camera leaves objective reality behind, and we enter a vaguely defined visual space. Is this how Marc understands his fate, as his body goes into shock, or are we literally seeing his spirit drifting towards some higher plane? The existence of which, by the way, was sort of established in the previous episode. But there's more possible interpretations at play here than just these two. That's the main reason I love this moment. It's brimming with endless possibilities for interesting readings. So bear with me as I suggest a couple. We cut from a close-up of Marc, lying face up in a shallow pool, to a longer tracking shot of sorts, where Marc sinks, initially upside down, further and further down into this abyss. That initial reversal is worth noting, because in switching from this visibly shallow pool to a deep, dark, physically inconsistent blackness, the idea of unreliability is introduced. We now understand, consciously or otherwise, that what we're seeing from this point onwards can't necessarily be trusted. That's an important thing to establish, given the nature of the hospital sequence which follows this one. As Marc drifts down, he's striking a nearly Christ-like pose, which, together with the idea of a descent into water, suggests a baptism, a rebirth of sorts. This episode, up until this point, has placed a great deal of emphasis on the sins of Marc's past mercenary life, and the damage caused to people like Layla. Might this sequence be suggesting then that, like Christ, Marc must in a sense give his life as a sacrifice to wash the slate clean, and that also, like Christ, this may precede a rebirth, a revival of some kind? That being said, Marc's pose is Christ-like, but it's not a direct match. His arms are crooked, the crucifixion symbolism is nearly there but not quite, disfigured in some way. This reminds us that the mythic templates, the divinities of this story, aren't necessarily the ones we're used to. This is a story of Egyptian, unfamiliar gods and morality, not the more familiar Judeo-Christian images and reference we may be more used to. Maybe then, apparent symbols like this one become unreliable, just as unreliable as the weird, inconsistent physicality and diegesis of the sequence overall. At every turn, this sequence prevents us from reaching any true knowledge, any firm interpretation of what it means. Is this the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, Marc's soul finding peace in the beyond? Or is it the moon, which provides no light of its own, but deceptively reflects other sources? This implicitly poses the question, is Marc finding true light, true peace, or just some other trick? And of course, the moon also represents Khonshu. And if we understand this sequence as Marc's spirit drifting toward Khonshu, then that only raises further questions. Perhaps Khonshu isn't involved here. After all, he was banished in the previous episode, and the sequence only invokes Khonshu's symbol in order to create a sort of replay of Moon Knight's origin. The last time Marc was shot, his spirit was caught by Khonshu, before being restored as the god's avatar. Perhaps this sequence is restaging this, ironically. Wow, look where all that got you, Marc, right back where you started. That sort of thing. Or maybe we should interpret this moon as actually being indicative of some form of divine interference on Khonshu's part. Sure, the god was banished from the earth, but maybe he's still able to grab Marc's soul as it floats away. Maybe this image then is a hint, giving us a visual clue of how Marc will eventually return to the world of the living. But then Khonsu, the moon, this light, becomes a torch, as the shot drifts into the technicolor world of Tomb Buster. And what could that mean? Again, a number of things. If Khonsu is as a torch, does that mean he is ultimately good, a trustworthy guide for Marc, illuminating his path? Or should we think of Khonsu as a sort of anglerfish, since the explorer led by the torch nearly stumbles into a deadly trap as the scene continues? There's so many questions like these, so many possible answers suggested by this brief abstract transition, and I think that reveals a real textual richness in this moment. Marvel's visuals have recently come under fire even from fans of the franchise. To take an extreme example, there was that whole thing about a month ago where superhero Twitter about lost its damn mind over a slightly subpar shot of Flash in Spider-Man No Way Home. And thinking more widely, the visuals of these projects are often derided critically too. That's often more about color grading than it is about shot composition or transitions, but I think these are all pieces of the same larger puzzle. This episode of Moon Knight, this transition, it's not anything particularly flashy, but I think it really succeeds in adding an amount of substance, of depth, to Marvel's often basic cinematography. Think about how easy it would have been to just cut right from this scene to Marc in the hospital, watching the Explorer B-movie, rather than taking us on an unreal journey from Alexander's tomb, through the light at the end of the tunnel, and out into VHS land. No one would have complained about visual homogeneity if this transition wasn't in the episode. The unsettling design of the hospital would have wowed anyway. This transition wasn't necessary, but it made the cut anyway, and as a result, it elevates this whole final sequence. Elsewhere in Moon Knight, and elsewhere in other recent Marvel projects, particularly WandaVision, Loki, and Eternals, it's easy to detect that there are artistic voices behind the scenes, talented voices who were trying to elevate these shows and films above merely crowd-pleasing superhero spectacle to serious and interesting pieces of art. There are genuinely gifted creatives at work here. It may well be that this elevation hasn't quite come to widespread fruition yet, but as long as Marvel has writers and directors who keep dreaming up and fighting for moments like this transition shot in Moon Knight, I think we can say that things are going in the right direction. But that's about it for this video. I will return to Moon Knight when it wraps up though, and the idea of maturity that I brought up in a previous video, in order to assess how right my predictions and concerns were. Until then though, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to all my patrons on screen now, especially Kevin Douglas and Ian Fifield. Oh, and make sure you like this video, or I'll stuff your entrails in a canopic jar.